welcome all to the first lecture of the Saint Macrina Centre entitled Attending to Fire in the Desert. Attending to Fire in the Desert, Thoughts and Images for Our Time. Or perhaps phrases and icons for the sake of our time. One may sense in our time that we need to be in the desert, in the tone of voice, the spirit of our movements, our disposition towards ideas, our countenance towards others. In the desert, we may perceive thinking as prayer together, thinking as drawing near, as weaving movements relating pillars or principles, as a form of hesychastic energy. To realize this in our lives means that we must strive for a humble stance, open to the gifts of the past, the beauties of the present, and the feast of the future. For the Saint Macrina Centre, this means that our focus is on the clarity and strength of our own Orthodox tradition in order to engage properly with others. For without the turn inward, the turn outward becomes false, of an untrue hospitality for the other. This recovery or renewal of the vitality of one's own tradition implies close reading, close listening, close thinking, close dialogue. It involves a thinking that draws near, the aim of which is not the general idea or overall argument, but the beauty of an attentive method of approaching via particulars to the whole, or drawing near through the elemental to the ultimate. On this path together, seeking intimacy with the divine, the spirit of both hospitality and generosity is in order, described in words Geoffrey Chaucer used for his Clerk, in which, but perhaps which he could have applied to Saint Macrina as well. Chaucer's narrator in the Canterbury Tales tells us of the Clerk, "Gladly would he learn and gladly teach. Gladly would he learn, gladly teach." It's my favorite line in all of literature. In our talks and dialogues at the Saint Macrina Centre, we seek to commingle hospitality and generosity, learning and teaching gladly, to hear a new word or offer a renewed word, together to draw constantly near and nearer the fire, to be alert to the fact that divine energy doesn't end or die, but that we ourselves may turn aside and stride away, apart, if we're not attentive in our response. On this path together, we have inherited a guide, a criterion, a kind of sure-footedness, the tradition, and how it inwardly forms our casts of mind. From within the tradition emerges a sensibility of thoughts, of apprehension, of comprehension, that one may call traditional thinking. Traditional thinking is a mode of thinking given form and texture by the sensibility, the line, the rhythm, and tonality of our way of being together, our tradition. It is a thinking that is of the tradition, from within the tradition. To think from within its integral essence, which is loving regard, is to sound from within the scope and compass of the tradition's authority, to give phrase and texture to the life flourishing within its measured horizons, as it has flourished in the past and will continue to flourish in the future, God willing. On this path, as we seek to draw near, we move unto the gifts of our tradition. We strive to inhabit the mind of the mothers and fathers of the church, to partake of the way in which they strove to draw near to Christ in their day, as we do in ours. This is not retrieval, but embodiment, not repetition, but paraphrase. To make something present one's own, or to relate out of one's own something present. And this conjoining of roots and presence leads to our emphasis at the Saint Macrina Centre, which is the thoughtful aspect of spiritual friendship, of companionship, community, and communion. If one regards Simeon Goa's logo for the Saint Macrina Centre, the logo is on our webpage, the design, one may discern in its figure, as it were, two desert portals to which Christ, at the center, beckons and welcomes us. In the tradition, the desert is a place of fire and trial, through the struggle of which will emerge integrity, as will the fullness of the gift of life. As set forth in the Gospel of St. John, Christ speaks of this gift which comes through him. He says, I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. Here is our Christ who gives life, who is the lover of humankind, who delights in each person and their own fullness of being. The life that Christ gives is Zoe, life meaning, in plenty. And this gift comes to inwardly form our comprehension of all relationship, this Zoe which Christ gives. After the gift of life, Christ lets being unfold and blesses his creation. David Goa likes to remind us that Christ did only two things, blessing and healing. So after the gift of life, Christ lets being unfold and blesses his creation. This means that the gift, the giving, is authoritative, becomes authoritative, and therefore truthful, for it forms the integral essence out of which all movement flows. This authority is at best palpable. One must strive to feel the truth, feel the vital presence of truth, and then to trust, to proceed with confidence in this presence. This is to say that our life together is a gift. And when we think this whole thing through, our life, it ought to be considered and figured not in terms of critique, especially partisan or intellectual critique, but rather in terms of a gift, in terms of joy and of fire. That this fire and joy continue within tradition, endure over the ages, finds a witness in Archimandrite Vasilios, who in his book, Hymn of Entry, writes that in their dedication and liberation from what is non-essential, the mothers and fathers find themselves face to face with the miracle of the truth which itself reveals itself, and they are fired with a different reality. Theology is written upon them. They create a different mode of perception in those around them. Archimandrite Vasilios adds, what is required in patristic study in order to remain faithful to the Father's spirit of freedom and worthy of their spiritual nobility and freshness is to approach their holy texts with the awe in which we approach and venerate their holy relics and holy icons. This liturgical reverence will soon reveal to us that here is another inexpressible grace. The whole atmosphere is different. And that's from Archimandrite Vasilios. This liturgical reference, through which we obtain the fire of the saints' transcribed thoughts as prayer, as we do the fire which inheres in holy relics and holy icons, means that in what we seek, only the new, only the renewed word is essential. All casual transposition is set aside. In other words, when the fire is present, it need not be articulated at length. Nonetheless, all sincere relationship with the fire may be salvific. If one is drawn near, one's soul is warmed and fortified. If one perceives dimly or from a great distance, one may renew one's striving to begin to compass and span that distance, to make links of renewed strength in relation. This latter sense may indeed have brought our beloved Saint Macrina more public light. For her brother Gregory of Nysa's transposition of her thoughts into his work on the soul and resurrection may strike one as being of an occasional character, drawn on by mortality and by filial love. St. Silouan the Athonite comments on this question in his response to a visitor's inquiry regarding what the monks were currently writing. We aren't currently writing anything, he responded, for we have our library filled with the holy texts of the saints. But if it were to disappear somehow, then we would simply write the books again and continue to struggle in prayer. Here, there is no need to compose words about the fire unless a dearth or loss of fire occurs. Then one does present fire. The fire of theology needs to compass the elemental and the ultimate and hold them together as one integral event. This is the work of theology, to draw into vital relation a presence beyond us, or to draw nearer into vital relation with a presence beyond us. Here, presence, which is a metaphor for fire, means drawing near. And fire, which is a metaphor for presence, means intimacy, but an intimacy of tone, not line. An intimacy of tone, an intimacy of tonality takes us further than a line of arguments or theology, in the sense that our faith is a natural coalescence of line or thought, rhythm or tradition, and tonality or fire presence. This is to suggest that all intellectual and even noetic phrases only have depth when conjoined to sincerity of presence and the fire of spiritual rapport. Saint Sophrony Sakharov gestures towards this in his book on Saint Silouan when he notes that those that give priority to cogitation, not prayer, this is his words, are often misled. For assimilating without difficulty intellectually, assimilating without intellectual difficulty, even apophatic forms of theology, they content themselves with the intellectual delights experienced, however, not attributing due significance to their unconquered passions, in the overwhelming majority of cases, while apprehending the logical structure of this theological system, existentially, they do not attain the one they seek. Theology fired by cogitation rather than theology fired by prayer leads to what Archimandrite Vasilios calls a contemporary desiccation or disincarnation of thinking. He says, today, by contrast, we often take theology out of the theanthropic mystery of the church in which it was sung by the fathers and mothers, and transfer it to the field of mere academic discussions, where each person, remaining an individual, an isolated authority, states his opinion and goes away, never drawing near to the fire of the Godhead. That's Vasilios. Vladimir Lossky, writing in the Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, defines in response to this error the apophatic sense, which he states is essentially an attitude of mind which refuses to form concepts about God, which affirms that to know God is to draw near him, and yet in this drawing near takes great care with the form of ascent, as at each step of this ascent, as one comes upon loftier images or ideas, it is necessary to guard against making of them a concept, an idol of God. That's Gregory of Nysa's language, concepts as idol of God. Then, Lossky continues, one can enter into the theoria of the divine beauty itself, God insofar as he manifests himself in creation. And that's Lossky. This path is due to the very nature of Christianity, which, Lossky says, is not a philosophical school for speculating about abstract concepts, but is essentially a communion with the living God. That's Lossky. A communion in which one's thinking is not tempted, Lossky says, to cross the threshold of mystery or to substitute idols of God for God himself. This state of things means for Lossky that God is at the same time totally inaccessible and really communicable to created beings, transcendent and immanent. To correspond to this unity, one must strive to become, as Gombrowicz states, both more sophisticated and yet much simpler at once, so as not to be lost in refined abstractions, a sensibility that John Zizioulas deepens in his own account of apophasis, given in Being as Communion. Kata Zizoulis, the apophatic method or stance or way was developed in response to the accounts offered in the Platonic originist understanding of truth, which sees in the prefix afto, auto, afto, the highest way of indicating and expressing truth. In response to this, the apophatic theologians preferred the prefix hyper or hyper above, which implies, Zizoulis says, a radical reorientation in regard to knowledge and a removal of truth from its Greek base. Introducing apophasis to complement the emphasis of the Greeks, Zizoulis writes that, and I'm quoting again, the message of apophatic theology was precisely that the closed Greek ontology had to be broken and transcended, since we are unable to use the concepts of the human mind or of creation for signifying God, the truth. The absolute otherness of God's being, which is found at the heart of biblical theology, is affirmed in such a manner that the biblical approach to God contrasts acutely with that of the Greeks. Apophaticism rejects the Greek view of truth, emphasizing that what we know about being, about creation that is, must not be ontologically identified with God. That's Zizoulis. Zizoulis then quotes the central passage from Maximus's preface to his ecclesiastical mystagogy, where Maximus writes that God has a simple, unknowable existence, inaccessible in all things and completely unexplainable, for he is beyond affirmation and negation. That's Maximus. To which Zizoulis adds that, therefore, truth lies beyond the choice between affirmation and negation. The divine is beyond the categories and choice of affirmation and negation. Therefore, the truth is beyond affirmation and negation. The truth, which we know is the person of Christ as of the Trinity, or Christ as Logos become flesh, is not compassed by the categories of affirmation and negation. In the same passage of his preface, Maximus notes that positive and negative terms may be applied to the phenomenon of Christ, but not at all properly, not in terms of what is his own of his own, which is beyond our comprehension and may only be approached through a reverent method or a higher path. Method means methodos, higher path. Both Maximus and Zizoulis emphasize that apophasis is not negative theology, a confusion that Zizoulis stresses tends towards error, for it alters our sense of the incarnate Christ. Indeed, both positive and negative theology, which are often figured in terms of is and is not, and thus deal with the aesthetic, our mode of perception, and what is perceivable and thereby conceivable, positive and negative theology belong to the closed ontology of the Greeks. For truth as the apex of being is knowable in positive or negative terms, that is, cataphatically. For Christians, cataphatic phrasing, which means according to or from the word, is best used to draw near to the mystery of the incarnation of our transcendent logos, and may use the aesthetic word as for its relation. Apophatic phrasing, often held as the complement or the completion of cataphatic thinking, means of or moving from or of the mysterious essence of something. And apophasis is best used to draw near to the mystery of the transcendence of our incarnate logos. So cataphatic, the incarnation of our transcendent logos; apophatic, the transcendence of our incarnate logos. And apophasis finds its own unique form of movement through and beyond the aesthetic and the noetic. Each stance, method, movement, or way of thinking, cataphatic and apophatic, thus has as their telos a kind or quality of relation with the God-man, far from agnosticism. Both Zizoulis and Losky they coincide in this rejection of agnosticism. Zizioulas writes that apophatic theology by no means implies a theological agnosticism. Rather, the principal object of this theology is to remove the question of truth and knowledge from the domain of Greek theories of ontology in order to situate it within that of love and communion. He continues, it is only through an identification with communion that truth can be reconciled with ontology. It's only through an identification or a conjoining with communion that truth can be reconciled with ontology. Apophasis is the movement from our own unto his own, a movement beyond our capacities for perception and conception, or aesthesis and noesis, a movement according to the gift of life meaning of Christ, a movement through which the immanence of the image of Christ, which through the immanence of the image of Christ, one is offered and drawn near the transcendence of the fullness of Christ, through the aesthetic and noetic unto the fullness of the mystery of the divine. For Maximus, in whose ambigua one finds beautifully modulated apophatic thinking and phrasing, as this movement, this kinesis, is given texture by phrasing, so this phrasing is given texture by tonality. In order to be fruitful, our apophatic stance must be complemented or completed by what Maximus calls our reverence, humble tone of voice, a complement most evident in how things are phrased. This matter of phrasing and tone, which provides the key element of apophatic thinking, phrasing and tone, the key element of apophatic thinking, draws apophasis into relation with emphasis and even cataphasis, the three forms which crown thoughts and meaning for us. Apophasis, which is a way of drawing the sophisticated within the simple, realized and accomplished in phrasing and tonality. Apophasis is the highest movement of transcendent incarnation. It is a discipline around naming the mystery and refuses to turn words into concepts, or refuses to turn the logos into an idea. As a stance beyond the category, beyond the act, event, or inclination towards categorization, it tends the soil, not the flower, in gardening terms. Now, dancing between images of topography and topology, one might consider the event of thinking in this way. A theme, which comes from the Greek word to set or place, becomes something harvested for its flower, its fruits. A theme is harvested. A thesis, which means a specific placement or setting, or placing or placement rather, becomes an act of relating, theme and thesis. Diathesis, or through the thesis, indicates our disposition or stance. So theme, to set or place, something harvested. A thesis, a specific placing or placement, an act of relating. And diathesis, through the thesis, as translated into English as disposition or stance. On this ground, thinking, which draws together emphasis and apophasis, means moving through the thesis, the placement, to compass belonging. Thinking is moving through the placement to compass belonging, the joy of relationship. Following this, we may say, apophasis draws near the placement, emphasis, pardon me. Let me start that again. Following this, emphasis draws near the placement, while apophasis moves from within, with, through, and beyond the thesis, the diathesis, and emphasis. In this movement lies the truth of apophatic gathering and releasing, the way in which it compasses our created nature and gestures beyond it to its ultimate source. So the apophatic movement is the movement from within, with, through, and beyond, from within, with, through, and beyond. To expand a little, the movement from within, or out of the essence, exousia in Greek, gives it authority. Okay, exousia is a word. Out of the essence is translated into authority in English too. So from within gives the apophatic movement authority. The movement with, from within, and then with, the movement with, centers it in communion or noetic relation, to be with. The movement through makes it a companion to our aesthetic making, our formation, our figuration. And the movement beyond, by which something both is and is more than, indicates the surpassing or surmounting of created being, indicating the surpassing or surmounting of created being, means the openness of the horizon of tradition beyond our ken, the openness of tradition to the one in three, beyond distinction and beyond articulation. So apophasis, from within, with, through, and beyond. Apophasis is thus a form of watchfulness and attentive recognition that distraction and straying, or negative critique, do not belong on the path of the presence of fire. And indeed, we must strive to apprehend and feel the fire present in the working, the thinking, the aesthetic struggle, the drawing near. That is, one must strive to partake of the relationship of fire, inwardly formed and given texture through the phrases and tonality of our apophatic stance. One must strive to partake of the relationship of fire, inwardly formed and given texture through the phrases and tonality of our apophatic stance. The ultimate fire of relation or communion to which Christ invites us and draws us by his hand is the eschatological feast, of which we find striking foretastes in the desert. Thus, we read of Abba Arsenius that on Saturday evenings, preparing for the glory of Sunday, he would turn his back on the sun and stretch out his hands in prayer towards the heavens, till once again the sun shone on his face. Then he would sit back down. This refusal to rest without fire, this refusal to be inert while seeking fire, is echoed in Abba Joseph's relation with Abba Lot. When Abba Joseph tells Abba Lot, you cannot become a monk unless you become like a consuming fire. A stance deepened further in this further conversation they had. Abba Lot came one day to see Abba Joseph and said to him, Father, I keep my little rule to the best of my ability. I observe my modest fast and my contemplative silence. I say my prayer and do my meditation. I endeavor as far as I can to drive useless thoughts out of my heart. What more can I do? The elder rose to answer and lifted his hands to heaven. His fingers looked like lighted candles, and he said, why not become wholly, completely fire? Those are from the tales of the sayings of the desert fathers and mothers. This holy fire, which wholly becomes our own, is found in its fullness in the ways of our tradition. Yet it may be felt at some remove, even just on the aesthetic plane, such as in the paintings of Cézanne or the films of Straub Huillet, all of whom insist explicitly that one must have fire in the shot, something burning in the image, some fiery presence there, by reason of which the aesthetic work exists without excuse or explanation. And yet, if and insofar as we perceive no fire at all, we begin to wander, to stray within ourselves, and matters of hierarchy, authority, and movement are defined alone, of our own will, rather than in holy relation. This becomes a turn inward to find the truth by one's own lights, rather than a turn inward to gather oneself for an encounter with truth beyond and yet of our own, the truth of intimate communion with the divinity. This is a straying from relation rather than a staying with relation, and it becomes of a certain confusion, inflation, certainty, and conclusiveness, which ultimately means inertia, the death of dynamic movement. For Maximus, this form of turning inward becomes one of self-indulgence and vanity. In aphorism 58 of his 3rd century on love in the Philokalia, Maximus writes of this straying condition, this self-indulgent condition. Just as parents have a special affection for the children who are the fruit of their own bodies, so the intellect in this state naturally clings to its own thoughts. And yet, just as to passionately fond parents, their own children seem the most capable and most beautiful of all, though they might be the most ridiculous in every way, so to a foolish intellect, its own thoughts appear the most intelligent of all, though they may be utterly degraded. The wise man does not regard his thoughts in this way. It is precisely when he feels convinced that they are true and good that he most distrusts his own judgment, his own discernment. He makes other wise people the judges, the discerners of his thoughts and arguments, lest he should run or may have run in vain, and from them receives assurance. That's Maximus. Without confirmation from the voice of a companion in the way, one begins to mistake oneself, says Sophrony, and then one's thinking, even if heightened, remains of its own, confined to the sound of its own voice, echoing apart from company. Sophrony writes that those apart like this may understand themselves to arrive at a supramental contemplation, yet what they then contemplate is still merely beauty created in the divine image. Since those who enter for the first or only time into this sphere of the silence of the mind experience a certain mystic awe, they mistake their contemplation for mystical communion with the divine, whereas in reality, they are still within the confines of created human nature. That's Sophrony. Here, one mistakes one's own for his own. One mistakes one's own light for that of the light of the divine. The movement by which this happens begins with our straying, our stepping over the calls to first love the Lord thy God with all thine heart and all thine soul and all thy might. And second, to love thy neighbor as of thine own self or thine own gift of life. To step over these to an abstract love or critique on a grand scale, on a maybe cultural scale, a national scale, even a global scale, if we get excited. The judgments one pronounces here are easier to make, and as they are of one's own will, one has control over them. There's no mystery. One judges and the world observes. Now, this straying gives rise to confusion, the confusion of the boundaries or horizons of our soul and imagination, the confusion of aesthetic and noetic categories with our will at the center. With one's will as the arbiter of our own confusion, one becomes inflated, begins to take one's own ideas and self to be all, to be the whole story, the source of ideas, apart from relation. This leads to a sense of intellectual or spiritual certainty, a form of self-idolatry and self-satisfaction, a sense of the security, the assuredness that one's own ideas and sense of things will prove the truth of the future. This certainty partakes of the spirit of conclusiveness, a state of mind in which one begins to inhabit a kind of frozen truth, a truth apart from the shared energy of loving communion. Conclusiveness means to stop moving and thinking, to halt our ascetic and noetic energy, to stop moving and thinking unto inertia and identity, the death of moving and thinking, rather than moving unto their completion in response and integrity. The damage done by linking thought with critique and meaning with identity or naming perhaps cannot be overstated in our time, whether in terms of culture, theology, or intellect. For they are idols unto inertia over against response and integrity. A response of integrity, by contrast, forms the heart of a Christian stance, our rooted being unto each other, For as Christ is our model, he who is without change or confusion, our model of integrity, in that all reality meets and finds its essence in him, coalescing in energy and unity in his figure, so his loving response, his blessing, his healing, becomes the archetype of our own response. For Christ is and is more and more than is more. His being renders all division, all divisiveness and dissociation, all categories of identity, of critique, of naming moot, lesser than life, surmounted and surpassed by the beauty of his integrity. By contrast, when life is stilled, it becomes frozen and conclusive, even frozen and conclusive in truth. One loses oneself, one loses the cosmos, the adornment of creation, and one loses the divine. This is recognized in our literature. Gombrowicz states that when personality pauses in identity rather than delights in dynamism, the self is reduced and cauterized. Bakhtin states that one never properly coincides with oneself, and that the answer to this is either an erring inflation of oneself or Christian ecstasis, the standing out beyond oneself in loving movement. And Juna Barnes states that seeking certainty leads one to stilled images of life, meaning, as she puts it, an image is a stop the mind makes between uncertainties. Isn't that beautiful? That's Barnes. An image is a stop the mind makes between uncertainties, which, given its origin in self-focused passion, makes it, as she says, perhaps like a child's drawing, where the composition is skewed by the unchecked passion of a solitary voice ringing out in the void, apart from company and confirmation. Circumscribed in this way by one's own interested concern, one's movements are hindered, hemmed in, found to be awry, for without the rhythm common in tradition and necessary for presence, out of which discernment is formed, one has only one's own frozen truth, one's own inert images. At this point, with our own self-image mistaken for the fullness of life, our only recourse is insistence, to indulge our will to be right, to be righteous, to be or become first, prominent. This is rather difficult spiritual terrain, especially as or if one thinks one draws near the truth in one's mind. Indeed, the urge for insistence, even within the language of truth, may indicate spiritual ill-being. We are told by Sophrony that Silouan never insisted, Saint Silouan never insisted, never repeated his own point to gain an advantage over another, never devolved into that all too common temptation to engage in argument with who is right about God, the temptation to counterfeit theology via self-interested projection, to reduce the divine to a subject for argument, and then to proceed in the belief that God depends on me being correct, correctly formulating his existence. This is unholy activity, to be rejected as that which mars the image of God in one's own countenance. In contradistinction, one's countenance, here understood in the sense of prosopon or hypostasis, is formed in loving regard and transformed in loving response. Formed in loving regard and transformed in loving response, finding its truth in prayer with the divinity and in presence with other persons. This is countenance as emphatic presence, as drawing together the fruits of our ascetic and noetic registers, as that which manifests our being for the sake of, or being unto the divine, as the Godhead, the divine is the Godhead, or the divine in another person. If being for the sake of means being unto, our constant question becomes, are we, is our being, are we unto God, friend, and neighbor? Or are we, is our being, unto our own self-image for the sake of? Being unto is a disposition, a diathesis, to come back to that word, through the thesis, not a line of argument. It means to desire to inhabit a certain spiritual stance of loving response inwardly formed by tradition, not to master a set of concepts and syllogisms, although these are very significant. Being unto, being for the sake of God, friend, and neighbor, means to exchange a pattern of thinking for a rhythm of breathing, to exchange a pattern of thinking for a rhythm of breathing, to move from abstract to inhabited appropriate form, to shift from being unto certainty of truth to being unto the fullness of life, being unto the fullness of life, as it is renewed and wondrous in each new moment, each vital relationship, and each sincere phrase of prayer or presence. It means to adopt a stance and breathe into it, to feel its suppleness, its compass, its measured horizon, to feel these elements as expansive and yet within reliably appropriate form, where everything is felt to be and to belong as, in, and of one integrity. For by expanding a stance with a deep breath of life, one may not only feel its contours more surely, but further discern its ripeness for relation. Being unto means cultivating a stance of response, of co-response, of co-responding with God, friend, and neighbor, a stance of co-relation, of correlation, coalescence, a sense of being together, co-being, complementing the gifts of the other with our own, and completing or making whole the event of relation with the other person. The full ethos of this stance means that as response is deepened into co-response, co-responsiveness, correspondence, it becomes synergy, synergia, a co-responsiveness of the person to the Holy Spirit, the divine gift of life and breath. Our ethos means both our character and the directedness of our souls. Our stance is formed by our being as person of God. Our stance as person of God. As person, we are formed by the methods of drawing near inherited in the tradition. Of God, we are formed by the grace of the gift of life-giving meaning, Zoe. Thus, the ethos of our stance becomes one of co-being, in which grace and method coalesce, through which we perceive the gift of authoritative life, filled with the divine energy to which we correspond, out of the gift of our own personhood, seeking to draw near with grace, the presence and operation of synergy of the Logos made flesh, the Logos become flesh. A synergy which, as Michael Burke put it beautifully recently, attends our almost every thought. And this grace and synergy, our co-being and grace and synergy brings joy, brings peace rather, if our stance, our rooted openness, our being unto, if our stance has readied us, and if we have cleared away intrusive thoughts, made room, and filled our lamps with oil, awaiting our bridegroom. Here, our readiness for synergy, our receptiveness to grace depends upon our method, our stance as person unto the Holy One. Our method, our higher way towards, our higher way towards ascetic and noetic synergy with the divine, with the Holy One as three, is built on our capacity for loving regard and response, which defines our personhood. Loving regard and response defines our personhood. And so our method is to cultivate our attentive openness, our prayer, to cultivate our attentive openness for what is present here in relation, part of the gift of today. To clarify this method, this struggle for presence, one may dwell and draw near simply in terms of the desert. In our tradition, the desert is a place of fire, the place of elemental trial and of ultimate assaying, a scene of spiritual patience. To be in the desert, we read, Abba Piman often said, we do not need anything except a vigilant spirit. That's Abba Piman. This vigilant spirit is directed towards familiar distractions of either environment or public recognition. So we read that when a brother asked Abba Piman, how shall I behave in the place where I live? The elder replied, have the mentality of an exile in the place where you live. Do not desire to be listened to. Do not desire to be listened to, and you will have peace. The vigilant peace of which Abba Piman speaks is of the desert, but its strength is measured by the depth of our turn inward and whether it gathers us within ourselves for the encounter of a beauty and presence beyond, greater than ourselves, or whether it ends with our turn inward become self-fixation, enamorment with our own willed self-image, oblivious to presence and communion. Thus we read that a brother came to Scetis to visit Abba Moses and asked him for a word. The elder said to him, go, sit in your cell, and your cell will teach you everything. And we also read that Abba Amonis said, a man may remain for 100 years in his cell without learning how to live in his cell. In the desert, understood in terms of a metaphor for many of us here, not all of us here, but many of us here, we pause, we are present, and we pray. Pausing in the desert means to stay, to listen, to feel, to think, to compass, to attend, to be vigilant, to be watchful. And we pause for the sake of presence. Presence means spiritual and personal sincerity of relation, and it is the truth of integrity. Presence is the truth of integrity. Maximus speaks of this presence and truth of integrity in Ambiguum 7, when he refers to a saint as one who has already become one with himself in this life. As we seek presence and the truth of integrity that we may pray well. Here, prayer, understood as lifting up one's soul and voice in offering to the Theos, begins our intimacy, our communion with God, even as our prayer must be attuned to our stance, to our path of synergy. On this path of synergy, a significant question arises. How do we pace ourselves? What is the length, the strength, the measure of our stride? We must proceed patiently as one neither inert nor arrogant, neither overreaching nor overweening. Rather, proceed alert to both presence and hierarchy, the relation of which is another open, ongoing question in each moment of mystery and delight. We strive to perceive the ultimate and elemental as in one rapport, as in one figure, as within the horizons of our gift of life. And in our efforts to be present in synergy, to the work of a transcendent presence within, we bear the ascetic and the noetic as integral aspects of our soul, of the integral dance of our soul, integral aspects of the dance of our soul. For the tradition, integrity means and encompasses presence and the movement of presence, moving beyond presence, the movement of presence beyond itself. And in this play of presence, authority, emphasis, and apophasis find their placement. In Orthodoxy, our prayer, our liturgy, and tradition teach us about emphatic authority, and these inwardly form our consideration, our composition, our comportment, which teach us about apophatic authority. The movement of the former, prayer, liturgy, and tradition, in the latter, consideration, composition, and comportment, becomes an aesthetic question, a matter of sensible relation, the question of appropriate form. How does each element inwardly form the other elements in light of the ultimate whole? The realization of this integrity is manifested in an inner transformation, a transformation unto the essence of the gift of life, and played out and recognized via the authority of our consideration, our composition, our comportment. Within this creative energy, this aesthetic energia of integrity, emphasis stays with the thing for its own sake, and apophasis stays with the thing in order to compass and sense within the horizon what is more than, beyond, from, and of that thing. In this way, apophatic movement gestures towards our modern horizons of faith, the place of our phrasing of faithful aphorisms. Emphasis and apophasis coalesce in the phrase, especially the aphoristic phrase, as the phrase rather than the term, the concept, definition, or argument. The phrase proves the center of meaning, whether spiritual or otherwise. Phrasing is of the vital currents of the soul, and it is of the moving flow of the energy of the logos, itself theandric. And I'll finish with this. This theandric energy is our phrasing. This theandric energy is our phrasing in and through and from Christ, and becomes our ultimate method. We partake of the logos in and as movements, the phrasing of our being in Christ, the phrasing of Christ's figure himself, which becomes our own. And as we paraphrase Christ as logos, in our own ways, in our own lives, we seek to draw near the presence of our logos, who gives us both fire and horizon. All right, thank you. That's part one. Now, we have time. We have time to enter into dialogue. Let's enter into dialogue. We might begin with the end, or with what we went over towards the end.